Hello and welcome to Your Life in 10, Series 1, Episode 10 with the author and journalist Peter Hitchens. Enjoy. Peter, the first question I want to ask you is possibly quite unrelated to what we're doing today, but it's something that I'm curious to know is, when you were a young revolutionary, did you ever think that it would be this successful revolution?
I thought it'd be a completely different kind of revolution.
Right.
I was basically hoping for a sort of Edwardian type of revolution, where we seized the post office and the barracks and the railway station. I had no idea that it would take this shape or form, and it never crossed my mind. We had very little understanding then, particularly of the huge possibilities of computers, although they were being developed, and we still very much thought in romantic terms, based on the Bolshevik Revolution as we then thought it was in 1917. So no, not the faintest clue.
Right. Did you still believe that the sort of proletariat would stand with you?
Well, that was the Leninist theory, that the revolutionaries would form a vanguard party which would both stimulate and to some extent replace the working class as they rose against their oppressors, and turn this into a more equal and progressive society, or some such stuff. I mean, I haven't thought about this for some time. Forgive me if I can't give you the full manifesto.
Of course. So in today, are you a bit disappointed with the sort of managerial sort of middle class vanguard instead?
Well, no, it's not the kind of thing that I thought of, and in any case, I went off the idea of revolution quite soon after leaving university. I began to think it was morally and intellectually foolish and undesirable. So the thing is, an awful lot of my fellow revolutionaries at the time went on to work in trades and professions and areas of the world in which they continue to think in that way, but they adapted their thinking to the changed world. And so they became the moral and cultural revolutionaries, which we got, really, first of all, moving into all the important jobs between, say, about 1970 and about 1990, and who came into politics and took over the Labour Party again in the 1990s and became the government in 1997, and then took over the Conservative Party, making their victory complete.
Did many others sort of follow the same path as you, where they ended up with a sort of Burkean reaction in the end?
I don't know. I haven't been in touch with most of the people I used to know then. One of the things about doing what I did is that you lose contact with almost everybody you used to know. I doubt it very much. I mean, I've had a very unusual life, not like most people's, and it's been my great advantage that as a result I don't think like many other people, and I necessarily have to plough the old lonely furrow cliche. Because that's where things lead me. But other people, I think, for many reasons, prefer to be part of a more collective, more sociable, more conventional way of living and thinking. And it wasn't hard, particularly if you stayed, say, in the teaching profession or in anything connected with universities or broadcasting. It wasn't hard to continue to be surrounded by a whole set of left-wing radical assumptions about everything, from sex and drugs and rock and roll to marriage and all the rest of it, that fitted in very much with the changes which were taking place. 1968 was a crucial year, which so many people who didn't live through it don't understand it. It was a revision by the left of their own aspirations. They wanted something. They decided that the 1917, the Lenin model was clapped out. They'd seen it give out its last gasp in the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. It didn't want it anymore, and so the left began to recreate itself in a completely different form. I say an awful lot of it about personal autonomy as I say, sex, drugs, and rock and roll and culture, and much less about the economy and about the dictatorship of the proletariat and all that stuff. But it was still extremely radical. It was a return in many ways of revolutionary thought to its 18th century beginnings, which is actually a lot of where Karl Marx's thinking came from. The diversion into trade union movements and the working class and Leninism really came in the late 19th and early 20th century, and there's no reason why the radical left should stay obsessed with those things, and in fact, many reasons why it shouldn't. And 1968 was prefigured 1989, which is when the remnants of Leninist revolution collapsed, and the great Leninist state collapsed in the Soviet Union and its satellites. And after that, the left was liberated from that great albatross hanging around its neck and was able to concentrate on the things it was really interested in, changing the way we live.
Looking back on a year like 68, as someone like me who was born in 96 and has no real connection to it whatsoever, I think of the riots in Paris and de Gaulle having to flee the country, the weather underground in the States. Do you think, in a way, given that the year after everyone was going on about Woodstock and peace and love, that they kind of got away with it?
Well, you mix up some different things. And what happened in France was quite interesting. A row about male access to female dormitories at the University of Nanterre, which broke out, interestingly enough, at the opening of a new swimming pool. That row, which created Daniel Cohn-Bendit as a major revolutionary leader, was a fascinating indication of what this was about. As I say, it was about the personal autonomy, the freedom of the body, sexual liberation more than anything else. De Gaulle didn't actually make all that many concessions. What he basically did was go to his old friends in the army, who he was afraid would take revenge on him for his treatment of them during the Algerian crisis, and begged them for support. So he stayed in power for a little while, but in the end, it finished him off. And that was the end of conservative France. And it was in some ways the end of conservative Europe, because de Gaulle was really the last socially and morally conservative leader of any major Western European country. And it was interesting that I wrote a review of Julian Jackson's fascinating and brilliant biography of de Gaulle, in which I explore this and why it was de Gaulle who was the leader who was actually overthrown by this movement, and what it meant. The American experience is rather different, and I think Woodstock has any political content. In fact, I thought at the time that the fuss about Woodstock was overdone, and I still think so. Peace and love was always rubbish, anyway, wasn't it? That was never going to happen. Altamont was always a better expression of the true nature of the rock revolution. And so no, I wouldn't include that in it, or the Weather Underground, who were of tiny irrelevance.
Yeah, you mentioned Altamont being a far better comparison. There's something like there were like 2 deaths and 3 births or something in Altamont. It became very violent. That was the point about it, and I think also violence in a racial way at one point as well. But the real problem with Altamont was that it showed that if you gave up all restraint, then it wasn't just that people were able to make love with whoever they wanted to, but other things happened as well, and that was the warning that came out of Altamont, which contradicted the soppy, false message of Woodstock that peace and love in a haze of dope would save the world, which was, as I say, not going to do. You mentioned rock and roll among other things. I'm looking at the items that you sent me on the music, and they're very sort of they're classically focused. Were you listening to rock and roll back then? Was that part of it?
I stopped listening to what I would then have called pop music. I stopped listening to it as a deliberate decision, almost entirely in 1969. Okay. I decided at that point I should grow up. I began to try, unsuccessfully, but to try to educate myself in the classics. And if you ask me about what we then called groups and what are now called bands since 1969. I won't even know who they are. I won't. If you played me their music, I wouldn't be able to identify who it was who was singing or playing. I know nothing about it. I deliberately, as an act of decision, said I'm sick of this stuff and I don't want to have anything else to do with it. That was long before I made my political steps away from Marxism.
Let's get into your list then, and we'll start with music because it seems like a good bridge to jump across. And the first item you gave me is Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, especially the second movement.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about that and what that means to you.
I can't talk about music any more than I can talk about wine. I know I'm not educated in it. I don't know anything about it. What I do know is that it has a profound effect upon me, as does architecture, and that as architecture is frozen music, I suppose you could say that music is liquid architecture. These things, I'm aware of the effect that they have on me. I'm aware of being raised morally, particularly by experiencing them. So if you spend a few days, for instance, studying the stained glass windows in the Cathedral at Chartres, you will end it as a better person than you were before, just as if you listen to. And I named Beethoven's Seventh Symphony and all the odd number symphonies, except for the first, which I don't know anything about, are absolutely extraordinary to me. I named the slow movement of the seventh because it just seems to me to be unrivaled in power. What it says, I wish I knew. That it says something, I have no doubt. Something good. I know that it's something good, but I don't. That's as far as I can go. There's the great passage in which I think got cut out eventually in Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, where he describes the beautiful red Burgundy which he drinks with the appalling Rex Mottram at that rather odd dinner in Paris. He attempts there to describe the effect there of wine on the human soul and mind. And it doesn't succeed, but you know what he's driving at.
It's an interesting comparison between music and architecture, and I think the malaise is quite the same between classical and modern. Where if you look at modern architecture, it seems to be more striving towards sort of shock and glory and vanity than it is towards.
Well, I used to like it. I mean, I never liked the tower blocks, but I used to. When I was in my revolutionary period, I was afraid of the Gothic. I found it. I felt besieged by it and lectured by it, and quite rightly, because it was besieging and lecturing. And the message that it had for me was that there were limits to what one could do that I had at that time denied. Also, I was very very anxious to deny death, and modern architecture is so full of light. There is no darkness. That if death is something you don't want to think about, then modern architecture is often very convenient to you. You can walk in its great halls and never be reminded of the fact that there is darkness. But there is.
Certainly there is.
I came to appreciate that there's that great line in 1984, isn't there, where O'Brien says to Winston Smith, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." And you think, well, that sounds rather appealing. And then when you discover what the place is where there is no darkness, it's the Ministry of Love torture chamber, you understand it's a double-edged expression.
Do you listen to the whole thing or just the second movement?
Oh no, this is the whole thing. But the second movement just is the most powerful part of it. Now, there's also a particular part of the Fifth Symphony which is difficult to like because it's a cliche. It's like say someone say, "Well, what's your favourite bit of Shakespeare?" So actually, Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. And I can't think better than that. It is a very good speech, however. and I wish I knew it by heart. But there is a particular passage in the Fifth Symphony in which I feel as if I'm looking down from a great height on human history.
Yeah, I found that too, listening to especially the second movement, where it kind of around the 5 minute mark it begins to sort of so around 2 minutes it begins to sort of swell and rise, and then it kind of increases.
Well, yes, I think the simplest expression, but this is only available to religious believers, of course, that music of this kind is the voice of God. But again, what is he saying? I hope to find out at a later stage, but I'm not qualified to say so now. But I think the power of these things is that, mind you, the power of popular music is considerable as well. It's much coarser. It uses the beat of the drum as something very close to a physical drug, for instance. And there are certain chords, certain guitar chords, and you could tell as soon as you hear them that someone's playing with your mind.
Yeah, there are certain scales that I believe hit the same part of the brain as like erotica and cocaine and that sort of thing.
That's maybe the musicology is a subject which, if I had time, I would really get into, but I never have, so I don't know.
We'll move on to the next one, which is I Know That My Redeemer Liveth, from Handel's Messiah. I listened to this last night when you sent me the list, and I don't think I'd ever heard an opera in English before.
What is it's not really an opera, is it?
It's an
oratorio, but
yeah, sure.
The libretto, as it's described, is fascinating. I forget the name of the person who did it, but he should be remembered better. But it is the most extraordinary distillation of scripture, and of course, for me, it has the added advantages of being taken entirely from the authorized King James version, which it has made to everybody who's heard it utterly memorable in that way that music does. If you set anything in music, it sticks in the mind far more than it would if you just heard it in prose. And the selections which he made are just extraordinarily felicitous. But that particular air, which it's quite surprisingly is actually from the Book of Job of all places, and there, of course, because there are words, it isn't just music. There's no doubt about the sublime intent of it. I mean, people go on, and the Hallelujah chorus is the only part of the Handel Messiah I don't really like. It's just too noisy for me. But then to slip into the I Know That My Redeemer Liveth is always extremely moving.
Yeah, I had quite a bizarre experience listening to it, because part of my connection with that kind of music is that I can't really understand it, but I can hear the words, I can understand them, and it's strange, and it's odd to sort of get to grips with the themes of what's being discussed rather than just.
Well, what's being discussed in the Messiah is pretty much what every Englishman believed. It is an encapsulation of the what was then, and Handel understood this very well, and as did the man who chose the passages of what English people then believed about the Christian gospel.
So redemption, resurrection, second coming.
Well, I mean, I'm not. Let's not discuss it. If you're any doubt about that, listen to it.
Similar to my question in the last piece of music. It's from a vast oratorio in Messiah Part 3. So, what is it about that particular segment that stands out to you?
I don't know. It's extreme beauty.
Just inexplicable.
The fact that the beauty of the words matches the beauty of the music.
When do you think music kind of lost that kind of that rule to it?
I don't know. Has it done so? It's not. Music has always been a tool for the sacred and the profane. and it remains so. My other choice of music, Elizabeth Poston's Jesus Christ the Apple Tree, is a 20th century arrangement of a very old hymn or poem. I'm not sure which it is.
Yeah,
but the music is actually astonishingly modern.
Well, so let's move on to that one then. It was initially a poem. It's been set to music by a number of composers: Jeremiah Ingalls, John Rutter, and Elizabeth Poston. Is there a particular reason that hers stands out to you? Was it around when you were?
The first time I heard it, I could barely speak. It's just so potent. And again, the sentiments expressed are to me, particularly appropriate. She was doing it, she was arranging it, I think, round about the time I was having my most complete break with civilization. So I feel particularly strongly that it's a rebuke to me. That just seems to me to be a work of genius. And again, it's the way in which the words and the music serve each other's purposes.
Well, we'll move along to your books. You start with Dickens' Great Expectations.
Yes.
It's a coming of age story. Did you?
Is it?
I believe so. Well, not necessarily in the sort of
to reduce it from the size of a sort of gigantic cathedral to the size of a small hut. No, it's a tremendous parable of human folly, vanity, which many of us may well have experienced, then being brought extremely low. It's also, but the other thing about Dickens is that he is a poet in terms of no one else is allowed to write like that, or ever would be able to do so again. But the force and intensity of the writing, I can only think of one modern author who begins to get anywhere near this. There's a man called Robert Penn Warren who wrote a tremendous novel called All the King's Men. It's basically about Huey Long, the politician, but it verges into it without being pretentious or stream of consciousness or any of that sort of rubbish. The prose quality is so musical that it verges on the edge of poetry almost all the time. You can't stop reading it either. I can't. I should probably put it on my list, but you didn't give me enough space. It is a tremendous book.
Well,
but the Great Expectations is just. The other thing about Great Expectations, which makes it live on the page even more, is a very, very rare thing, which is that a film was made of it by David Lean, which is as good as the book, and also is very faithful to the book, though it's briefer. And anybody who's seen the film and read the book has in his mind not merely the pictures painted by Dickens but also the pictures provided by David Lean, which in this case don't cancel out or get in the way of the imagination, but enhance the imagination. It's terribly melancholy, which I like. It's full of the great high melancholy skies of the parts of Kent in which Dickens did so much growing up, which has such a profound effect on him.
Do you find catharsis in melancholy, or is it just a sort of a
I've never really been able to remember for more than about 30 seconds what catharsis is, so I doubt it.
I suppose a vicarious purging of emotion.
Yeah, well, in that case, probably not. No, you need time for this. But I live in these books when I'm reading them.
Did you read this book when you were young then?
Well, compared with how old I am now, everything I did in my life I did when I was young. Yes. Okay. But I don't suppose I actually fully. I think I must have seen the film 2 or 3 times, but I don't think I actually read Great Expectations from start to finish as a book till I was in my 30s. And then I wished I'd done it before. Same with Copperfield. I mean, Copperfield is probably as good, but it doesn't. It has some passages in it of description, such as the Great Storm, which are unrivaled. But in the end, I think the moral message to arrogant young persons such as myself, the moral message of Great Expectations is pretty much biblical. It could be a book of the Bible to me.
Is it a book that you return to or have returned to?
I have returned to it. I think I just find myself getting busier and busier, and to pull down a Dickens from the shelf, however well thumbed it is, and set out on it, and knowing it's that thick, in the life that I've been leading for the past, 7 or 8 years, it hasn't really been. I just don't think I've been able to imagine myself finishing it. So not lately.
When was the last time?
Couldn't say.
Okay.
And another thing about reaching my age is that the time telescopes, things that you think happened 10 years ago, actually happened 20 years ago.
You will have to forgive me if me being 24 becomes glaringly obvious every now and then, Peter.
It's not your fault. So I can't blame you for it, but it's not something you need to take any responsibility for either. That's how you handle it. That's the point.
Let's move along again. Your second book is John Steinbeck's East of Eden.
Yes.
Most people, at least people my age, will know it as a James Dean film, but
it was a terrible film.
Yeah.
The film barely begins to touch on the book, which is largely to me about the possibility of redemption, about how people are not trapped by their pasts, inevitably to relive and sink down to the levels that they. It also contains one character of such total unremitting evil that I just gasp at the creation. I can only imagine she must be drawn from the life. They're the horrifying Cathy. But the thing itself is again, it's as with Great Expectations, it has and look at the title, which comes from the story of Cain and Abel. This is a biblical parable on which people can begin to base some kind of moral understanding. The purpose of literature, it seems to me. It can be very sad as well. I mean, one of the saddest passages ever written in English is towards the end of his brilliant travelogue, Travels with Charlie, where he returns to the California of his childhood and remembers.
It's one of those books. I remember reading it in A levels, and it's one of those books that.
You did? I'm amazed because normally you get with Steinbeck, it's either of Mice and Men because it's so short.
Yeah, Mice and Men was year 10 for me, I think.
Or it's The Grapes of Wrath because it's so left wing. Grapes of Wrath is a good book, but it's beyond doubt it's a propaganda book.
No, yeah.
Whereas East of Eden isn't so, and I just found it more interesting in the end than Grapes of Wrath.
But yeah, very very fortunately, I was given it to read in English lit. It's one of those books, and I can't quite pinpoint why, but it reminds me of a few Russian authors where the setting is so vividly described, but it's almost as if the location is a character in and of itself. I distinctly recall the opening of the book with a very delicate description of the Salinas Valley, and it kind of stuck with me the whole time reading it.
Well, no doubt. There is a lot of landscape in it. Nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of landscape in Dickens as well, isn't there? And cityscape.
Okay, we'll move along again. to your third, which is a trilogy, actually. Olivia Manning's The Balkan Trilogy from The Fortunes of War. What is it about the Balkan Trilogy as opposed to the Levantine Trilogy or the series as a whole?
Well, the Liveth trilogy is good, but it's not. It doesn't quite have the same. For me, it's the Balkan trilogy, which I read after I spent 2 and a bit years living in Moscow, in a life not wholly an expatriate life in a very strange foreign city and some sort of rackety circumstances, I suppose. It lives for me so much because of that description of expatriate life in a strange, remote, and politically extremely odd place. I think that as I read it again, I'm living in it. I think it's. I've come to think that it's the best English language book about the war. I used to think that Evelyn Waugh's Sword of Honour trilogy had that place, but I now feel that Sword of Honour fades away at the end into a sort of moral flatulence because Waugh himself became more or less prosperous and happy in his life after the war, and didn't see, as I think Olivia Manning does, how very much the time of war had exposed the poverty, weakness, and fatuousness of so much of what Britain had once stood for and no longer did. There's a tremendous moment in. I say the trilogy because I've first read it in 3 volumes in one, and I find it hard to mark the boundaries between the books. There's a particular scene after Dunkirk when the British community in Bucharest have rather bravely have decided to hold a Shakespearean production, and I think Troilus and Cressida, and at the end of it they hold a celebratory party in their block of flats, and they make such a racket that one of their Romanian neighbours comes down and hammers on the doors. Who do you think you are? You're not a great power anymore. You can't disturb the house the way you used to. And in some ways, it's a central part of the book, the realization that they are actually not anymore the representatives of great power who can lord themselves with foreign currency and the feeling of being representatives of great power in a foreign city full of small people. They're actually on the same level. And she does this again, actually, in the Levant trilogy, where it looks as if Rommel is going to arrive in Cairo, and Harriet speculates that they'll be stuck there. And if it weren't for the fact that Muslims were charitable, they would have nothing to hope for at all. And these are real things. She'd lived in the period in Bucharest, genuinely afraid that the Germans might get there and she would be interned, and heaven knows whether she would ever come out again of whatever place the Germans put her in. And then she was in the Middle East for a long period during a time when the fall of Cairo was both expected and actually hoped for by an awful lot of the Egyptians. So she lived on the edge of danger in a way which many people have not done. I just find it extraordinary. I think it's beautifully written too. And I think she's underestimated, and she thought she was underestimated. There's a very interesting biography of her. She was known to her friends as Elizabeth Moaning, because she complained so much about being underrated. But I think she was dead right. She was underrated. I'm all in favour of trying to put that right.
Of the books you've listed, this is the one that I haven't read, so I'm going into this a little bit.
Well, then you should. I can't recommend it highly enough. They've just brought the trilogy out in 3 separate volumes again, and I think I recently reviewed it on my blog. I recommend that you actually follow my advice and read it. I don't think you'll be disappointed.
Oh, so I have so far. So this is the 5th episode that we've recorded, and I've bought at least one book from each recording. So I might make that one mine. But what I know about it is what I've read from reviews and that sort of thing. And is there a sense of sort of claustrophobia in the story where the shadow of the expanding Reich is almost chasing the characters throughout Europe and money's running out?
Sorry, I don't think like that. No, what there is a sense of is that they're alone and unprotected. The truth is that Olivia Manning and her husband Reggie Smith, who was a communist, worked for the British Council, which was not a diplomatic organisation, and therefore they had no diplomatic protection. They were British subjects, as we then were, living in a foreign city, which they went out to on the assumption that if the war, which had just begun, would be a stalemate like the First World War, in which places such as Romania would remain more or less safe. And then they suddenly, while they were out there, found that that wasn't so, that Europe had become a place which was not safe for British people, even in their obscure corner of it. And amongst many other aspects of life which are described in there, the feeling of being completely on their own and vulnerable is very present, and it's claustrophobic. Exactly, it's just fear. And when she finally leaves, I won't describe how she finally leaves Romania. But also, there's one other thing which has to be mentioned in any discussion of these books, is the extraordinary character of Prince Yakimov, who must be one of the great. Dickens would have been proud to have created such a tremendously comical and yet villainous, and yet also a lovable person. It's an amazing literary creation, and it helps the books to sing.
Is he the White Russian character?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be one way of describing him. But he's only in. He doesn't feature, for reasons I will not disclose. He does not feature in the Levant trilogy, only in the Balkan trilogy. My goodness, that's a creation.
Well, I look forward to reading that. You've given it a very good sales pitch. On that, let's move along to your film, which is Witness, starring Harrison Ford.
Yeah, and Kelly McGillis.
Yeah.
It's got everything. It seems to me. I don't. It zips along at a great pace. Have you seen it?
Yes. I saw it.
And for those who haven't, it concerns a Philadelphia detective of some coarseness and violence, ending up living among the Amish in a small village in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where the Amish continue to live their 17th century life with that. I think they have. I don't have electricity, do they? I'm not sure, but it's the conflict between the two, and of course the growing attraction between Harrison Ford and the daughter of the house, who's played by Kelly McGillis, raises huge numbers of questions about who is the civilized advanced person. There are a couple of particularly marvelous scenes, among many. One where a couple have gotten married, and what the Amish do when a couple marries is the whole community come and they build them a barn in one day.
Yeah.
And this is filmed with some superb music by Jean-Michel Jarre accompanying it, and must be one of the most moving scenes ever filmed. And then there is the scene where these people who will not kill and will not use weapons subdue violence in their midst.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's also, on the other hand, to balance this out, the scene where this actually is based on things that actually happen to the Amish when they go into areas of the country where ordinary Americans live, where Harrison Ford is dressed in his Amish gear is mocked and teased as someone who won't fight for his country and won't fight for himself by some lout. And you watch and you hope that something will happen, and it duly does. And it's terribly satisfying when it does, though it's disastrous, of course, for all the good people in the film. It is what with that, and also the bit of Marvin Gaye, wonderful world. I just think it's got everything.
It does have everything. It's got it's got thriller. There's a love story there. There's a sort of an old world meets new thing where you have the innocence of retrograde life. As you said, the Amish don't use weapons. Coming into contact with the big bag city and corrupt cops and murder and intrigue.
Yeah, but I can't say at this stage whether good triumphs or not. You'll have to watch it to find out.
Yes. Did you watch it in the cinema?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd watched it subsequently in other places, but I did the first time I saw it. I watched it. And in fact, one of the versions I've seen since has a little bit of semi-nudity in it, which wasn't in the cinema version. Quite frankly, I could have done without that.
Yes. Do you own a lot of like physical media in films? Do you own like DVDs and that sort of thing?
Well, I suppose I do. I've been alive since these things were invented. You pick them up.
The question then was do you still have these things?
Well, it becomes increasingly pointless because if I used to have a load of videotapes, for goodness sake. And what's the point of having those? I still miss the crude and simple original video recorder with a counter on it, where you could work out where things were and write it down and watch what you wanted to. But there you are. I know most of the stuff I need help to watch.
We'll move along again to your objects, and I find this to be the most interesting item on anyone's list because each one is different. So far, I haven't had two of the same. I've had an instrument, a painting, a family heirloom, and yours is an opulent cathedral that's not too far from Paris. It's Chartres Cathedral in France.
Yeah.
Why Chartres as opposed to the myriad of wonderful churches around the world?
Are there that many? So many of the great churches of the world have been in some ways wrecked at some point in their existence. But a couple of miracles, Chartres survived, particularly the French Revolution. And what it is its completeness. It was also built very, very quickly as an act of devotion by peasant and aristocrat alike. It's unlike any other cathedral. And there are cathedrals in England which I love greatly and would recommend anybody to go and see. But if I had to, I would prefer Chartres to them because it is so unique, particularly the glass. And the building is astonishing, and the sculpture extremely powerful. But the stained glass of Chartres, both in terms of the colours, which I don't think men could make now, and the stories which are told in them, it is more or less the scripture in stone and glass. And if you go in the winter, which I recommend people to do when the tourists are not there, the small, quiet French provincial town, wholly dominated by this building, which comes from outside normal time, is an experience which any thinking person ought to have. And it's not really that difficult to do, or it wasn't until we entered the current state of mad panic. It was an extremely easy journey. And if it ever becomes possible to travel again, it will be one of the things that I'm anxious to do.
Do you have a particular memory of going there?
Well, I have two. The first time I went not really understanding, and the second time I went when I prepared myself by reading and by bringing what everybody should take as a pair of binoculars, because you can't really see the glass properly unless you do. So it was an illustration to me of how much difference it makes if you prepare for travel and if you don't.
There's some quite interesting statues kind of built into the stone as well. Inside.
Oh yeah, so the statues are very fine, but the glass is and the some extraordinary internal as well as external sculpture. But the glass is really beyond that level. It's even greater.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see that it's still taken seriously. That I believe it was restored about 10 years ago. Especially.
Well, if these places are not restored, they fall to the ground. It's not. You can't just leave a building like that. The problem is restoring them without wrecking them. And the glass in York Minster is in many cases superb as well, and it's the only thing I think in England which begins to compare to Chartres. But the experience isn't as intense. Chartres is quite a dark cathedral. Whereas York, certainly these days, is very light, and it's the darkness that I think emphasises the impact. I think I've been to Chartres 3 times in my life. The most recent being about 8 years ago. But I used to travel around France in my late 20s and early 30s almost all the time. It's always seemed to me that an English person who was able to travel to France and didn't do so was making a great mistake. And there it is. It's more or less another planet on our doorstep, full of things which are both similar to us but very different, and crammed with beauty of all kinds. And so I used to, when I was free to do so, we used to roam about France. That was the first time I went, and then a second visit, I think, while I was living in Moscow, which was all too brief, and then the third one when I actually made a proper study of it. But there are parts of France I used to travel invariably by train and stay in terrible old station hotels, long ago closed, with brown lino floors and iron bedsteads, and had a wonderful time of it. France is not as captivating as it was in those days.
Yeah, and a lot of the French cathedrals are sort of a lot of harm's coming to them in the last couple of years.
I wouldn't know.
Yeah. I wouldn't advise looking into it because it's utterly heartbreaking.
You wouldn't advise what?
I wouldn't advise looking into the decline of French cathedrals because it's quite heartbreaking reading.
Well, I mean, I think you expect their whole status is different from that in England. They still contain a great deal. There's a lot of them I haven't seen. So and still hope to see. So I don't. I only went to the extraordinary Basilica of Saint Denis in Paris a few years ago, which again, people go to Paris and they have no idea it's there. Strangest places on earth.
Have you ever been to Avignon in the south of France?
Oh yeah.
I remember going there when I was about 8 to my family and not really being aware of it. Then going back when I was 17 and just being utterly just captivated by it and the history too.
Yes. It also contains a bridge named after Edward de Ladier. Which I don't think there are any bridges named after Neville Chamberlain in his British equivalent in England.
It pretty wouldn't cross the water.
The bull of the Vaucluse, as they called him. Yeah. Anyway, you don't want to talk about that. I have walked across the Pont Edouard de Ladier to the other side of the river, where you get an absolutely marvellous distant view of Avignon. It's a long slog, though.
Yeah, I bet. Your historical figure is the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley.
Yes.
Is that well? I mean, he's a very sort of achieved a lot in his lifetime. Most known for obviously his victory over Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo.
Yes, I think the lack of nonsense in his life is very appealing. I think you get the strong sense that he was laughing at other people a lot of the time. I think there's something there which I would like to get closer to. I think people sort of, soldier, reactionary prime minister. I think probably a person of huge imagination and humour. There's a very good portrayal of him, which I think must have been very well researched in, I think, the first of the Flashman books by George MacDonald Fraser, which rings true. He's not fooled. And that's what I like about him, the feeling you could not have fooled him.
Mm. Mm.
And also, of course, they put that together with the extraordinary achievement. Imagine having the responsibility of the Battle of Waterloo, or come out of fighting your way up through Spain in the Peninsular War. Imagine having the responsibility, really, of the whole. You can lose the whole war. You can lose the fight for civilization in an afternoon, and yet he seems to have borne it.
There's there's a rather humorous story from that battle. I say humorous, given it's a bloody battle, but the British were behind a hill and the French were launching artillery, and he just ordered the British to lay down, so the artillery was going right over them, and then when the French marched, they just popped up and just decimated them, really. Maybe
so. I don't know. I'm not. It's an impression. I'm not. I asked for a figure. I thought, well, let's see. And I've often felt that there was something. There was more to this person than simply the grandeur of the great Duke and the victory of Waterloo. I get the strong impression from everything I read about him of something much more profoundly witty and thoughtful and imaginative than you would expect of a soldier. And I think there's something about the Goya portrait seems to me to suggest this quite strongly as well.
What do you make of him as a prime minister?
Not much, but I don't think. I mean, it was a bad time to be prime minister, and I'm not really very interested in that side of it.
Right.
And he was also very old.
Yes. He opposed the Reform Acts, right?
Well, yes, he did. It's an arguable case, but remember, he also was in favour of Catholic emancipation. I'm not really terribly interested in his politics. I'm interested as a person who one would perhaps, I don't know whether one would have liked to have met, but would have benefited from having met. I think he comes pretty high on the list of people in English history.
Oh, in what way then do you think he would have benefited you?
Well, I think he would have seen right through me. Never bad for anybody.
Right. He wouldn't have minced his words at all.
It's not a question of that. I think some people see. Some people are easily deceived. Some people pay little attention, and others see what's in front of them and recognise it. And you can't fool them. And I think they're rare. But I think that even if you wouldn't necessarily come off well in an encounter with them, that's not a bad thing.
Your contemporary figure is the Bishop George Bell.
Yes.
Why him?
Well, because he did what he was supposed to do, and he was a minister of the Christian Church, and at a point where somebody very badly needed to say that this country, in a good cause, was doing a bad thing. He did so, and he damaged himself as a result. And that damage has been, in some ways, redoubled in recent time because of a very damaging allegation which was made about him anonymously a few years ago, against which I defended him. And I missed no opportunity, and so most of that damage has been undone now by a very, very determined campaign by me and other people, in which we set the record straight as far as we could. But it's still the Archbishop of Canterbury, to his shame, still hasn't fully admitted that they made a mistake in publicly blackening his name.
Are you referring there to his opposition to area bombing in Germany?
Well, the first thing I'm referring to is his opposition to basically to deliberately killing civilians as an act of war. The second thing I'm referring to is the allegation of child abuse made against him and publicised as if it were true by the Church of England, I suppose it must be 7 or 8 years ago now, against which I and some others chose to defend him.
What would he make of the current Church of England?
I have no idea because he's not here to say. I mean, it's given the way that its primate and some of its bishops have treated him, I'm expecting I might have been a little critical. But I don't think his concern about the organisation of the Church of England is minor. The thing about George Bell is that his concerns always in his life are so much broader than that. He very early on understood the evil of the German regime under Hitler and began to assist German Christians, and particularly Jews who'd converted to Christianity who were in deep trouble. And he also served as a sort of secret conduit for the German resistance to Hitler to Britain right into the war. At one point he actually, during the war, went to Sweden to meet representatives of the German resistance and brought messages back from them. He was also a man that's interested very much in the wider aspects of human thought. So when he was Dean of Canterbury, it was his idea to encourage Eliot to write Murder in the Cathedral, and to have it performed in Canterbury, I think, for the first time. He was a great patron of painters as well. And on one particular occasion, early in the war, when Winston Churchill had interned large numbers of German refugees from Hitler as if they were a danger, he risked and indeed obtained considerable unpopularity by saying it was ridiculous to lock up opponents of Hitler in such camps and standing up for them. It's a remarkable person and one who isn't celebrated enough. I happen to think that the deliberate bombing of civilians by Britain during the Second World War is a disgrace which we still shy away from acknowledging or regretting, and I think it poisons the morality of this country as long as we go on doing that, and it makes it far, far easier for people like me who were born in 1951, long after this had happened, to make the case against it. If anybody says, oh, well, that's just hindsight, I can say, no, it is not hindsight. There were witnesses at the time who spoke against it, and one of them was George Kennedy Allen Bell, and this is what he said. And it tends to silence the hindsight people quite a bit. Also, Bell was not a pacifist any more than I am. Then there's a tendency, people who are not pacifists tend to dismiss those who are, and whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'm not going to go into, but it's true. But the fact is, what George Bell believed in was just war. It's just that war should be fought only when absolutely necessary and should not pollute the principles for which it was fought. And he stood for that, and it was there weren't enough people who did, but he did. And so he would have been Archbishop of Canterbury almost certainly if he hadn't done that. But as it was, he was pushed to the side and in general treated with a certain amount of suspicion and mocked by people such as Noel Coward, some noisy super patriots of the time.
Which is,
I think this is to his credit. I think people like that they live in eternity in a way that small people who agree with what's going on around them all the time don't.
Do you have any desire to live in eternity for what you've said?
I'm sorry?
You mentioned that he lives in eternity. Do you have? Well,
he does. I think this is really what happens. The Shakespeare never wrote a less true word than the good that men do is interred with their parents, and the evil that men do live after them. It's true that evil does live on after people die, but goodness does as well.
Do you have any desire to live on in that sense after you've gone?
I don't have any choice as far as I'm concerned. As I understand and choose to believe in a universe in which there is eternal life. If there's no eternal life, there can be no justice. There certainly isn't any temporal justice, as anybody remotely capable of reading and looking around them can see. So if you want justice as much as I do, then you have to accept that it happens in eternity. So I've wished that into existence for myself, whether I want it or not.
thank you for listening to Series 1 of Your Life in 10. It's been great fun to make, and I hope you've enjoyed listening. We're going to take some time away, a few months, to sort of recalibrate before working on Series 2, but that should be out by the end of the year. If you want to listen to audio versions of full episodes of Your Life in 10, go over to bournbrookmag.com/podcasts and choose Your Life in 10. You can also find our other series, The Week in Review, where myself, Michael Curzon and Luke Perry discuss the week's political and cultural developments, and my long-form discussion podcast, Our Current Predicament. Thanks again, and God bless. Cheers.